She had stood in that hallway 100 times as a child. She knew the way the afternoon light came through the east window and fell across the stone floor in a long, pale stripe. She knew how the third step on the servant's stair creaked if you set your weight toward the left side. She knew that the portrait above the mantel in the east sitting room was hung slightly crooked, had always been hung slightly crooked, and that her father had refused to correct it because her mother had chosen that placement the week before she died. She knew all of this, and yet she stood at the servants' entrance of Haverstone Hall with a small trunk, a borrowed reference letter, and a name that was not her own. Emmeline Rayford pressed her hands flat against the wool of her skirt. She had rehearsed this. She had rehearsed it in the cold back room of the lodging house in Dunmorrow, where she had spent the last 4 months, sitting on a narrow bed that smelled of someone else's life, telling herself over and over that she could do this, that she had to do this. She knocked. The door opened almost immediately, as though someone had been watching from behind the small curtained window beside it. The housekeeper, a square-shouldered woman with iron-gray hair pulled tight at the back of her skull, regarded her without warmth or hostility, simply the level gaze of someone who had assessed a great many applicants and found most of them wanting. "Miss Hartson?" the woman said. "Yes," Emmeline said. The name came out steadily. She had practiced that, too. "I am Mrs. Polwarth. Come in." The kitchen was warm. That surprised her, though it shouldn't have. It had always been warm, even in the years when her father had been economizing. After the investments went wrong, after the solicitors began arriving with their careful faces and their careful voices, the kitchen had been kept warm because the cook, old Daphne, had insisted on it. Daphne was gone now. There was a different woman at the range, younger, with flour on her sleeve, who glanced up and then back down at her work. "You'll be taking Mrs. Sorrel's position," Mrs. Polwarth said, not asking. "Lady's maid." "Yes," Emmeline said again. "His Grace returned from the continent 3 weeks ago. He has guests arriving within the fortnight. The household has been in some disorder." A pause. "Lady Rosamond is particular about her things." Emmeline had not known there would be a Lady Rosamond. She had not known, in fact, that the Duke of Haverstone had any family in residence at all. The letter she had intercepted, the one addressed to her cousin Berthold, the one that had told her Haverstone Hall had been sold, that Berthold had sold it, her family home, the estate entailed to her through her mother's line, sold because Berthold had found a solicitor willing to argue that the entail did not hold, that a woman could not inherit, that Emmeline's claim was void. That letter had not mentioned guests or Lady Rosamond or anyone at all. It had mentioned only the new owner, the Duke of Haverstone, or rather, the man who had purchased the title along with the property. Caspian Aldwell, the second son of a northern merchant family who had made enough money in shipping to buy himself a dukedom and everything attached to it, including, apparently, 140 years of her family's history. She had expected to despise him. She had constructed a very thorough image of him in her mind during those 4 months in Dunmorrow. A heavy man, loud, someone who would put his boots on her mother's writing desk and not notice the gouge marks left behind. She had not expected him to be the man she encountered on her 3rd morning at Haverstone Hall, standing alone in the library at 6:30 in the morning, holding a volume of estate records from 1779, reading it with the focused quiet of someone who genuinely wanted to understand what he had read. He was not heavy. He was tall and lean in the way of someone who had spent years on ships in cold weather, and his hair was darker than she'd imagined, and he did not hear her come in because she moved without sound on the thick carpet. A habit from childhood, learned during the years when her father's headaches had been bad, and the whole house had gone soft-footed without being asked. She stopped. She should have left. She could see, from where she stood, that she had come for the wrong book. Mrs. Polwarth had asked her to fetch a household accounts ledger from the lower shelf, and Emmeline had come to the library because she knew exactly where those ledgers were kept, had always known, and that knowledge had made her incautious. She had not considered that someone else might be in this room at this hour, but she did not leave. She stood and looked at him reading her family's records, and something in her chest went very still and very cold. He turned a page. His hand was careful with it. She took the ledger and walked out without speaking, and he did not look up. Lady Rosamond arrived on a Tuesday, in a carriage that Emmeline could hear from 3 rooms away. She was the Duke's sister, it turned out, not a wife, not a fiancée, though Emmeline had spent 2 days bracing herself for either. Rosamond Aldwell was 22 and bright and exhausting, in the manner of people who had never been required to be quiet, who had moved through life with such consistent good fortune that the world's sharp edges had never quite found them. She was not unkind, that was the difficult part. Emmeline had been prepared for unkindness. Unkindness she could have held herself apart from, could have used as a wall. But Lady Rosamond tipped her head back and laughed at her own mistakes. She spilled scent on her dressing table and said, cheerfully, "That's entirely my fault, don't fuss about it." She asked Emmeline's opinion on her evening gowns with an earnest curiosity that suggested she actually wanted to know. And she talked constantly about her brother. "Caspian has been different since he came back," she said one morning, half turning in front of the glass while Emmeline pinned the back of her bodice. "He was always serious, you know the type. The sort of man who thinks before he speaks and then speaks less than you'd like." She laughed a little. "But now he's, I don't know, quieter, even for him." Emmeline moved a pin, said nothing. "He loved it here as a boy, did you know? We used to summer near this county when I was very small," he always said. She paused. "Well, I suppose it's silly," he said. "It felt like a place where things had been decided, like the rooms had opinions." Emmeline pressed her lips together. She thought of her mother, who had said something almost identical. "The house knows what it's for," she had told Emmeline once, on a winter evening, when the 2 of them had been sitting by the library fire, and the rest of the household had gone to bed. "That's rarer than you'd think." "He seems like a man who belongs here," Emmeline said carefully, because Lady Rosamond was looking at her in the glass and waiting. "Doesn't he?" Rosamond smiled. "I told him so. He didn't believe me. He said he was still learning the place." She had not meant to be seen. That was the rule she had made for herself in Dunmorrow, in the narrow room that smelled of other people's lives. Do not be seen. Not by the solicitors, not by Berthold's man, who had come to the lodging house once looking for her, because there were papers she was supposed to sign, papers that would formalize her surrender of any claim to her mother's estate. Not by anyone who might carry word back, and not, especially not, by the Duke who had purchased what was hers and whom she was watching from the inside, learning what he intended to do with it, whether he knew what Berthold had done, whether there was any path she had not yet tried. That was what she told herself, that it was strategy, intelligence gathering, that she was doing what she had to do. She was not sure, by the 4th week, that she entirely believed it. The Duke was up early every morning. She knew this because she was up early too, in the manner of someone who had stopped sleeping well somewhere around the time a solicitor's letter had taken her life apart. She saw him in the library sometimes, in the long corridor that ran along the east side of the house, where the light came in at an angle she had loved her entire life. Once in the garden at the back, where he stood for a long time looking at the state of the kitchen beds, which had gone to weeds in the months the house was empty. He was learning the place. That was what Rosamond had said. Emmeline watched him learn it, and felt something she did not have a good name for. Grief, maybe. A complicated species of it. On the morning of the 5th week, he spoke to her directly for the first time. She had been coming down the back stair with Lady Rosamond's breakfast tray. A shortcut, the fastest way from the kitchen to the upper floors, the way she had been taking since her first week because she knew it, and the other staff did not question her knowledge, assumed she had simply explored, and she rounded the landing and nearly walked into him. He caught the tray before it fell. Both of them stood very still for a moment. His hands were on either side of the tray, bracing it, and her hands were under it, and the distance between them was smaller than it should have been. He looked at her, a direct, considering look, the kind that did not slide past but actually arrived, and she looked back at him and felt her heart do something she had not given it permission to do. "I beg your pardon," she said. Her voice was steady. She was very grateful for that. "The fault was mine," he said. "I don't usually take this stair." "Nor do most people," she said, and then wished she hadn't, because it was too knowing, too specific, the sort of detail that a lady's maid with 6 weeks of employment should not have had a particular opinion about. But he only tilted his head slightly. "You know the house well for someone recently arrived." "I find my way around quickly," she said. "I always have." He considered this. Then, without anything more, he stepped aside to let her pass. She did not look back. It was Berthold who ruined it. Of course it was Berthold. He arrived on a Thursday without an invitation, in a hired coach, with the confident stride of a man who had convinced himself that confidence was the same as a right. Emmeline saw him from the upper corridor window and felt the blood leave her face so quickly that she had to put one hand against the wall. She had known this was a risk. She had known it from the beginning. Berthold had sold the estate to the Duke, which meant the Duke presumably knew Berthold, or at least knew of him, and Berthold had known Emmeline her entire life, had sat across from her at her father's table for 20 years, would know her face in an instant, whatever name she was using, whatever uniform she was wearing. She thought very quickly. She could not avoid him entirely. The house was not that large, and her duties brought her through the public rooms at predictable hours. But she could minimize. She could be elsewhere. She could. She was still standing at the window when she heard from somewhere below the sound of Berthold's voice in the entrance hall, and then, a moment later, the Duke's voice answering him. They knew each other. Of course they did. Berthold had sold him the house. She pressed her back against the wall. Through the floor she could feel the low vibration of conversation without being able to distinguish words. She stayed there for 3 minutes. 5. Then she straightened, smoothed her hands over her skirt, and went to attend to Lady Rosamond's afternoon dress. Rosamond was in good spirits. She did not notice that Emmeline's hands were not entirely steady while pinning her sleeve. "Berthold Rayford is here," Rosamond said, examining herself in the glass. "Do you know, I have never liked that man. He has the eyes of someone adding up figures while you talk to him." Emmeline said nothing. "Caspian doesn't like him either, I don't think. But there's some business matter. Something about the estate transfer that still needs resolving." She tilted her head. "He had a cousin, did you know? The original heir. A daughter. But he managed to have the entail set aside. Apparently there was some question about whether the terms of the original grant extended to female heirs. Very convenient for him." The pin went into the fabric, not where Emmeline had intended it. "I'm sorry," she said. "Hold still, please, my lady." "Of course. I'm talking too much." But Rosamond met her eyes in the glass, and her expression had shifted slightly. "Become more attentive, more careful. Are you all right?" "Perfectly well," Emmeline said. "Thank you." She came downstairs too early. She had been careful. She had checked the times, had known that Berthold was to be in the east drawing room with the Duke until 4:30, and it was 4:45, and she had believed it was safe. But she came through the door at the bottom of the servants' stair into the main corridor, and Berthold was there. He had been heading toward the cloakroom, probably. Wrong direction for the drawing room. She understood, in the fraction of a second before his face changed, that this was simply bad luck, unplannable, the sort of thing you could not account for, no matter how carefully you had constructed your situation. His face changed. "Emmeline," he said. She did not respond. She held herself very still and met his eyes and did not say a word. "What on earth?" He took a step toward her. "What are you doing here? What name are you using? Are you mad? If Aldwell finds out that you—" "I work here," she said quietly, "as a lady's maid. My name is Hartson. Your name is Rayford," he said. His voice had gone low and furious in the way she remembered from her childhood, from the rare occasions when Berthold felt cornered. "And you have no business being within 50 miles of this property. I will have you removed." "On what grounds?" "On the grounds that you are—" He stopped. Looked past her. She turned. The Duke of Haverstone was standing at the end of the corridor. He had clearly heard some portion of this exchange. How much she could not know. His face gave nothing away in the manner of someone who had learned, over the course of a life, not to let his expressions run ahead of his thoughts. He stood perfectly still and looked at her, and she looked back at him, and for a long moment the corridor held all three of them in a silence that had weight to it. Then Berthold said, with the smooth recovery of a man who had spent decades managing other people's perceptions, "Aldwell, I was just surprised to encounter. I had thought this girl was. I would like," the Duke said, "to speak with Miss Hartson, alone." Berthold's mouth closed. "If you would wait in the drawing room," the Duke said, "I'll join you shortly." The word shortly had, in his voice, a precision that left no room for argument. Berthold looked at Emmeline once more, a look that promised something she had no interest in receiving, and walked back the way he had come. The Duke waited until the sound of footsteps had fully faded. "Emmeline Rayford," he said. It was not a question. She considered, for a moment, several different things she might say. Denial, misdirection, a version of the truth small enough to contain. She had been prepared for this conversation, or a version of it, for 5 weeks. She had imagined it many times, and yet, standing in the corridor of her mother's house, looking at this man who had bought what was hers, and who had gotten up at 6:30 to read her family's records with careful hands, she found that none of those prepared answers would come. "Yes," she said. He was quiet for a moment. Then, "Come into the library." The library had not changed. That was the thing she noticed first. Walking in, he had not changed it. The shelves were the same, the arrangement of books the same. The slightly crooked portrait of the 3rd Viscount Haverstone, her great-great-grandfather, still hung the same way it had always hung, because nobody had moved it. The Duke stood by the window. He did not sit, which meant she remained standing too, which she preferred. She did not think she could have managed to sit. "How long?" he said. 5 weeks, she said. "I arrived the day after Mrs. Sorrel left." A pause. "And before that, a lodging house in Dunmorrow. 4 months. Since the transfer completed." He absorbed this. She could not read him. That was the difficulty, had been the difficulty since the back stair. He processed information without broadcasting it, which was either admirable or maddening, depending on one's circumstances. "The entail," he said. "My mother's family's land," she said, "passed through the female line for 4 generations. The original grant specified heirs of the body, without further restriction. My cousin paid someone to argue it differently." "I know," he said. She had not expected that. "I beg your pardon?" "I know." He turned from the window. His expression was, for the first time, not entirely composed. There was something underneath it, something that looked like controlled anger, directed not at her. "My solicitor told me 3 weeks ago that there were irregularities in the transfer documents, that the original entail language was ambiguous at the most charitable interpretation, that a more careful reading—" He stopped, started again. Rayford came recommended by someone I trusted. I had not done sufficient inquiry of my own. She was very quiet. The afternoon light came through the east window and fell across the floor in a long, pale stripe, exactly as it always had. "What were you intending to do?" he asked. "If you had not been found, learn what you knew," she said. "Whether you were aware of what Berthold had done, whether there was a course of action available to me that I had not yet tried." She paused. "I had written to 3 solicitors who refused me. I had written to my father's old friends, most of whom did not reply. I had very few remaining options. And this one," he said slowly, "required you to spend 5 weeks in your own house pretending to be someone else." She did not answer that. He looked at her for a long moment. Then he said, "The portrait above the mantel, in the east sitting room." She went very still. "It's hung slightly wrong," he said. "I noticed it my first week here. I kept meaning to correct it." A pause. "Is there a reason it was left that way?" She thought of her mother, of a winter evening and the library fire and the sound of the house settling around them like a held breath. "Yes," she said, "there is." He nodded once, as if this answered something he had needed to know. "Sit down, Miss Rayford," he said, and his voice was for the first time entirely different, quiet in a way that was not cold but something else, something she did not have an immediate name for. "I would like to understand what was done here, and I would like to understand what should be done to correct it." She sat. "It took 4 weeks. Not because the matter was simple. It was not simple. There were documents and counter-documents and 3 solicitors, and one very stubborn letter from Berthold's man threatening consequence. But because the Duke of Haverstone was methodical and patient and had resources that Emmeline, in 4 months in a lodging house in Dunmorrow, had not had, he did not ask her to leave. That was the thing she had not anticipated. She had assumed, after the corridor, after the library, that she would be sent away while the matter was resolved, kept at arm's length, treated as a problem to be managed from a safe distance. Instead, he said, "This is your house. You know it better than anyone. I would rather you were here." She stayed. She stopped calling herself Hartson at the end of the first week, after the Duke said, very simply, one morning over the estate accounts, "You don't have to do that." She told Lady Rosamond the truth, because Lady Rosamond had looked at her with those careful eyes for long enough that Emmeline felt the weight of the withheld explanation becoming unbearable. Rosamond sat very quietly through the telling, and then said with a heat that surprised Emmeline, "Berthold Rayford should be ashamed of himself." "He isn't," Emmeline said. "No," Rosamond agreed. "Men like that rarely are." She took Emmeline's hand and held it for a moment with a firmness that felt like a statement. "But Caspian will sort it out." And Caspian, she had started to think of him that way, without meaning to, somewhere around the 3rd week, did sort it out. She was in the garden the morning the final document came through, the one that confirmed the entail had been improperly set aside, that Berthold's solicitor had misrepresented the original grant language, that the transfer would need to be revisited. She was looking at the kitchen beds that had gone to weeds. She had been thinking about what she would plant there, if she could, whether the soil was still good under all the neglect. She heard the door behind her. "It's done," he said. She turned. He was standing on the step with a letter in his hand, and his expression was the composed one she had learned to look past by now, the one that had something else moving underneath it. "There will be a process," he said. "The court filing. Berthold may contest it. It won't be immediate." "I know," she said, "but the solicitor says the case is clear. The original language of the grant does not support what was argued. Your claim to the estate is legitimate." She looked at him. He was standing in the garden of her mother's house, in the morning light, with a letter that changed everything, and he looked the way she had not expected him to look. Not like someone concluding a business matter, not like someone who had resolved a legal inconvenience. He looked like someone who had wanted this outcome for a reason beyond the legal. "This house will be yours again," he said, "as it should have been." She was quiet for a moment. The kitchen beds needed work. The third step on the back stair still creaked if you hit the left side. The portrait above the mantel was still hung the way her mother had chosen, and someone had decided not to move it. "Where will you go?" she asked. He was quiet. "When the transfer reverses," she said. "You purchased this in good faith. You've been here 6 weeks. You've been learning the place." She stopped. "I'm asking genuinely. I'm not pushing you out. I'm asking." He came down the step, crossed the small distance between them in the manner of someone who had been considering a thing for some time and had decided, finally, to stop considering. "I had been thinking," he said, "that the house is large enough for more than one opinion about it." She looked at him. "I had also been thinking," he said more quietly, "that I would like very much not to leave, and that there may be a way to resolve that which does not require either of us to go anywhere." The morning was cold. The garden needed work. The kitchen beds were full of weeds and the possibilities of what they might become. "You should know," she said carefully, "that I am very difficult. I have been told so on several occasions." "I have been told the same," he said. "I suspect we will manage." She looked at him for a long moment, this man who had gotten up at 6:30 to read her family's records with careful hands, who had noticed the portrait was crooked and had not moved it, who had spent 4 weeks making sure that what was hers was returned to her even at the cost of his own claim. And she felt something settle in her chest that had not been settled in a very long time. "The kitchen beds," she said, "they need replanting. I know what used to grow there." He looked at them. "Tell me," he said, and she did.